Welcome to Mortification of Spin, a casual conversation about things that count, with Carl Trueman and Todd Pruitt, a podcast of the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals. Let's join this week's conversation.
You are listening to Mortification of Spin, and it's so great to have you on with us today. So grateful that you're taking time to listen in once again this week. My name is Todd Pruitt. I'm the pastor of Covenant Presbyterian Church in Harrisonburg, Virginia, and I'm joined as always by my friend Carl Trueman, who teaches at Grove City College in Western Pennsylvania when he's not writing books and traveling the world. And so, Carl, great to see you again. I'm a little and I don't really know what to do at this point. I don't know what your schedule has been like, Carl, but it's unusual as I'm looking at you on this screen. You're not wearing a tie. There's no jacket. Have you just been out working in the lawn? What's the deal today?
It's the summer. The students have graduated. I no longer have to pretend that I respect them, so I'm able to go in my civilian dress. So
Excellent.
I'm glad to see that you're wearing a shirt with sleeves.
Yes.
That's a definite improvement on the usual sartorial presentation.
Yeah, it's a banner day for Mortification of Spin. I decided to wear a shirt that has both buttons and sleeves and a collar, by the way. So, so it's quite a formal affair today. We're excited about our guest today. No doubt many of our listeners will know who our guest is today. She is the author of many books. For years, she collaborated with the late, great Charles Colson and is an accomplished writer, a public intellectual, a Christian apologist. And we are here to talk with her about her new book. Of course, our guest is Nancy Pearsey, and Nancy has, you are familiar with so many of her books. Total Truth, the really excellent book, Love Thy Body, which came out just a couple of years ago. Such an important subject in terms of understanding humanity and the telos of the human body. And her latest book, which has the appropriately provocative title, The Toxic War on Masculinity. And so our guest today is the author of that book and so many other wonderful books, Nancy Pearsey. So good to have you with us, Nancy.
Thank you for inviting me here. It's a joy.
Absolutely. And also, being a Houstonian myself, Nancy is an instructor at the wonderful Houston Christian University, formerly Houston Baptist University. If you are looking for a really wonderful Christian university, there are several that you can choose from. Of course, Grove City College in Western Pennsylvania, but another one of those that needs to be on your list is Houston Christian University. Wonderful faculty there, and you may even be able to have an opportunity to be taught by Nancy Pearsey while you're there. Well, Nancy, let's talk about your new book, The Toxic War on Masculinity. And of course, as soon as I say the title of that book, people will understand the timeliness of it. We hear so much about quote unquote toxic masculinity. And certainly you would not deny that men are sinners just like women are, and that there are expressions of quote unquote masculinity that are sinful and fallen. And yet, you want to speak into this issue because in reading your book and in knowing so much of many of the other things you've written, you want to sound a warning on the fact that this pendulum of responding rightly to certain abuses has gone so far as to actually question and even more than just question, but outright condemn the very notion of masculinity itself as something that is God-given and constructive and good for humanity. So I wonder if you just address, first of all, how long this has been kind of cooking in your mind, and when did you decide this needs a book? I need to address this more fully. How did that come about?
Well, I was shocked at the level of hostility that it's become socially acceptable to express against men. Mm-hmm. The Washington Post had an article called "Why Can't We Hate Men?" Yeah, I thought, you expect that in some fringe feminist publication, maybe, but not in a mainstream newspaper like the Washington Post. The Huffington Post editor said her New Year's resolution was kill all men.
Yeah.
You can buy T-shirts that say so many men, so little ammunition.
Yeah.
And there are books out now with titles like I Hate Men and No Good Men and Are Men Necessary? So it's not surprising that surveys are starting to show. There was one that I quote in my book that 46% of men now say that these days society seems to punish men just for acting like men. And so I saw the problem and I saw a solution. So the problem was that men are being, like you said, masculinity itself seems to be what's being denigrated. And evangelical men in particular, Christian men seem to be exhibit A of toxic masculinity. And that wasn't hard to find quotes for either. Let me give you just a few of those, because here's a few that I found with a quick Google search. Conservative Protestant gender ideology can clearly lead to abuse, both physical and emotional. It's no secret that abuse is prevalent in conservative churches that embrace headship theory. That's from a Christian publication. The theology of male headship feeds the rape culture that permeates American Christianity today. So the problem with these accusations is they ignore the data from the social sciences. So if you want me to keep going, that's the problem. If you want me to keep going, that's the solution that I saw was that sociologists, psychologists have been doing studies. Essentially, they looked at these charges, these accusations, and said, where's the evidence? Where's the evidence? And so they did the studies, and these are fairly new, just in the last few decades. And so most people don't know about them. In fact, I had to go digging in academic sociological journals in order to find them. But what they've discovered is that evangelical men actually test out as the most loving husbands and fathers. So compared to the average family man, evangelical men are the most loving with their wives. And by the way, they do interview the wives separately. So what they're really reporting is that the wives say they are the happiest with their husband's expressions of love and appreciation. Evangelical men are the most engaged with their children, both in terms of shared activities like sports or church youth group, and in terms of discipline, like setting limits on screen time and enforcing bedtime. Evangelical couples are actually the least likely to divorce. And the real shocker was they have the lowest rates of domestic violence, contrary to all the things that we hear in the secular media and sometimes even the Christian media. So this was amazing. And Christians don't know this. When I speak on this to Christian audiences, universities, seminaries, and so on, invariably, people's jaws drop like, well, we had no idea.
Yeah.
And my go-to sociologist, so to speak, the one who did the largest study is Brad Wilcox at the University of Virginia. And let me give you a quote from him because it's a wonderful summary.
No bastion of conservatism, by the way. University of Virginia.
Oh, yeah, University of Virginia.
Yeah.
Well, let me tell you what, first of all, let me tell you his quote from the New York Times. It's New York Times. No bashing of conservatives there either, right?
Right.
So he gets quoted in the New York Times saying, it turns out that the happiest of all wives in America, they focus on the wives because the idea is that any sort of male authority or headship in the home is going to lead them to become overbearing, chauvinistic patriarchs.
Right.
So he focuses on the wives. It turns out that the happiest of all wives in America are religious conservatives. Fully 73% of wives who hold conservative gender values and attend religious services regularly with their husbands have high-quality marriages. So even Christians don't know this. And I love the way you mentioned his secular colleagues, because he then turns to his secular colleagues, academicians, sociologist, and he adds this. He says, academics need to cast aside their prejudices. Their prejudices about religious conservatives and evangelicals in particular. Conservative Protestant married men with children are consistently the most active and expressive fathers and the most emotionally engaged husbands. So, and by the way, he's Catholic. So in a sense, he doesn't have a dog in this fight. He wasn't out to show that Protestant evangelicals actually test out the best. And what I say then is that we really have empirical evidence. I mean, these are rigorous academic studies showing that Christians actually test out the best in terms of their family life and in terms of, fathers being loving to their wives and children. So I would like very much to get this news out. This needs to be out there. Christians need to realize that they're actually doing a good job. We need to encourage Christian men that the academic literature actually shows they're doing a very good job.
That's interesting, Nancy, and it raises a couple of other questions. So if the evidence is overwhelmingly in the direction that you say it is, where does the idea of toxic masculinity come from, and why has it come to focus upon the Protestant evangelical constituency as the villains? If there is so little evidence for that being the case, why has this come to grip the popular imagination?
Yes, the first question I always get is, haven't we all heard that Christians divorce at the same level as the rest of society? So researchers went back to the data, and they separated out the truly authentic, committed, church-going Christian men from the nominal Christian men. In other words, these are men who on a survey like this might check the Baptist box, but in fact, they attend church rarely, if at all. And they test out shockingly different. They fit all the categories of toxicity. Their wives test out as the least happy with their husband's love and appreciation. They spend the least time with their children. Their rate of divorce is the higher than secular men. And then the real shocker, they test out as having the highest rates of domestic violence of any major group in America, higher than secular men. And so what happens is, if you have a research project where you put, these two groups together, if you just say, let's look at evangelicals, you're going to get skewed statistics, because you're going to get people who are better than secular men, and you're going to get people who are worse than secular men. Yeah. And so that's why we have this misunderstanding. And it was incredibly important that researchers went back and made this distinction, because you and I probably hang out mostly with fairly committed Christian men. And so I always thought that, nominals are probably a small group. No, in America, they're a pretty large group. Yeah. We have a lot of cultural Christians in America still. And so, you have about a 50-50 chance that if you meet somebody that they're actually nominal, who claims the evangelical identity is actually nominal. And so this is the real challenge, I would say, for the church, is we need to figure out how to encourage the men who are doing well, and how to reach out to the men who are sort of at the fringes. And who people ask me sometimes, well, why are they actually worse than secular men? Apparently what happens is, they hang around the fringes of the Christian world to pick up the language of headship and submission. Right. But they infuse it with secular definitions of entitlement and dominance and control. But they feel they've gotten the religious permission to do that. Right. So they actually, with that religious permission, so to speak, they actually end up being worse than secular men. Yeah, it's like that's where the misunderstanding comes from.
It's like they've gotten just enough religion to inoculate them from the gospel, but they pick up on some of these categories that are in the Bible, but they do so as either very immature or just flat out unregenerate men who seize upon some of those biblical categories in a typically unhealthy way. Yeah. Now, you one of the statistics that you bring out is this dichotomy between church attendance by women and that of men. And there's been a growing divide there. as a lower percentage of men have been, attending church. Nationwide, there are some churches that are exceptions, of course, but in terms of the broad statistics, more women attend church regularly than women. And a lot of people have written on this. Leon Pottles wrote a book a number of years ago called The Church Impotent, where he was trying to warn about this problem and that sort of thing. I wonder if you have any ideas about why that has been a trend in evangelicalism.
Yeah, so Leon Pottles puts it back to the Middle Ages, but Rodney Stark says it was that way from the beginning. And the early church had more women than men. And he chalks it up to the fact that Roman culture was so negative in its treatment of women, that women in the Christian church had much higher status, were valued much more than in the surrounding culture. You probably know this. I mean, Carl knows this because he's a historian. But the Roman culture, men had perfect freedom to have sex with just about anybody. It was very accepted that a married man would have sex with mistresses and prostitutes, and most of all slaves, their own slaves, male and female, children and adult. And so I write about this in more detail in my book, Love Thy Body. But you have to keep it in mind for this book as well, that from the beginning, the Christian church has stood against cultures like the Roman culture, where women had very little status and wives were for having official heirs, but that's about it. They were not expected to have close emotional relationships.
Right.
They were not supposed to complain when their husbands had sex with a variety of other people. You even see it in the literature of the time. Women would often complain about their husband's infidelity, and they were basically told, oh, get used to it. And so when women entered the Christian church, they had much more status, much higher status than in the surrounding culture. So actually, we find literature saying even at the time that we have church leaders saying we have a lot more women than men. We're having trouble getting enough husbands for our young women. So you do see it even from the beginning. And so in one sense, that's a good thing. It does show that Christianity has always had a higher view of women than the surrounding culture. Now, I do agree with you that it also means we need to maybe think more carefully about how to bring men into the church as well. And so, yeah, that's another part of the book. But we should start by recognizing that it's not bad to be attractive to women, and it's been that way from the beginning.
Yeah, that's good.
Now, in your book, Nancy, you talk about the sort of the world today presents these sort of two scripts for masculinity for men. Could you outline what they are for the audience?
Yeah, this was really interesting. You guys might not realize this, but I was very surprised that this is the most controversial book I've written. I really thought Love Thy Body would be more controversial because it deals with abortion, homosexuality, transgenderism, and so on. But at least in the Christian world so far, this has been more controversial. Even though I teach at a Christian college, most of my young female students identify as feminist. And whenever I said anything positive about men, they would get triggered as though I were thereby denigrating women. But my male students were equally defensive. When I said I was writing a book on masculinity, one of my male students shot back, "What masculinity? It's been beaten out of us." So I found that this is a sociological study that found that there are really sort of two competing scripts for men out there in the general culture. And so I put this at the beginning of the book. The other thing I found is when my students, or I have several reading groups on the subject, so sort of rub off the rough edges. And when my students or my reading groups, they would talk about the book to their friends and family members. And invariably, the first question was, whose side is she on? With that tone, whose side is she on? Is she some male-bashing feminist or is she some angry reactionary? So I had to rewrite chapter 1 multiple times to try to overcome that initial barrier. And the two competing scripts helped a lot, what you just mentioned, Carl. This was a sociologist named Michael Kimmel, and he's very well known in his field. And so he speaks all over the world. And so he turned that into sort of a study, an experiment, where he would ask young men 2 questions. First, what does it mean to be a good man? You know, if you're at a funeral and in the eulogy, they say he was a good man. What does that mean? And all around the world, men had no problem answering that question. You know, from Australia to Germany to Ecuador, they all said the same thing. And I'll actually read it so you get their words. Honor, duty, integrity, sacrifice, do the right thing, stand up for the little guy. I kind of like that one. Be a protector, be a provider, be responsible. And the sociologist would ask them, well, where'd you get that? And they'd say, well, it's just in the air we breathe. And in the West, they would say, it's part of our Judeo-Christian heritage. And then he would ask a follow-up question. He'd say, well, what does it mean if I say to you, man up, be a real man? And the young man would say, oh, no, that's completely different. And again, I'll read you their words. That means be tough, strong, never show weakness, win at all costs, suck it up, be competitive, get rich, get laid. So in other words, there seem to be 2 competing scripts. Universally, men are made in God's image, and they do know what the good man is. Romans 2, you know, we all have got a conscience. We all know right and wrong inherently. And yet they are feeling a cultural pressure to be, quote unquote, the real man, which are the traits that we normally think of as more toxic, you know, dominance and control, get rich, get laid. And so I would suggest that the main debate is really not between men and women. It's within men's own head between these 2 competing scripts. And that suggests a strategy also, because it means instead of attacking men as toxic, you know, nobody responds well to being called toxic.
Right.
So a better strategy is to tune in to their intrinsic understanding of the good man. And how can we support that? How can we encourage that? How can we affirm that? And so that is a better strategy for helping men in our culture today.
Yeah, that's really good. And I not long ago, I said something from the pulpit. It happened to be in the midst of a sermon application, and I forget now what the text was. But as a part of the application, just kind of off the top of my head, I thought, you know what, I need to encourage the men in the young men in my congregation on this. And one of the things I just addressed for about 4 minutes was, young men and boys, I need you to hear this. Your maleness is not an affliction that needs to be cured, but it's a gift. God made you as a man. There are really, really good things about that. And it was interesting afterwards, the number of moms who came up to me after the sermon, some of them with tears in their eyes saying, thank you for affirming our sons, because they never hear this outside of our home. You know, they don't hear this at school. They don't hear this from the media or from the culture. And I got the most comments after that sermon about that small point of application from moms in my church.
Yeah, I quote a psychiatrist named Erica Kommissar. She writes for the Wall Street Journal. And she says, as a psychotherapist, I'm getting more and more young men who are discouraged and beaten down because our culture is so hostile to masculinity. And it is at least probably one reason why men and boys are doing worse today than in the past. As you know, boys are falling behind at all stages of education, from kindergarten, you know, all the way through college. Colleges tend to be roughly 60% women now. Graduate school, more women are going to graduate school, and even professional school like law and medicine. Men are falling behind in terms of rates of suicide, in terms of drug and alcohol addiction. And of course, they've always been more prone to crime. I mean, I used to work for Prison Fellowship, an international ministry. And of course, we knew 90% of people behind bars are males. Recently, though, their level of employment has gone down. They don't show up in the statistics anymore, so you have to go digging. But there are researchers who now say male unemployment levels are at depression-era levels. And male life expectancy has gone down in recent years. Women's has stayed the same, so it's not a general trend. Just men's life expectancy has gone down. And so this is what makes this so crucial, that we stop and say, okay, it's been great that girls are doing better in school. You know, they've had a lot of encouragement, and there's been a lot of money poured into girl positive curriculum and so on, but it's time to start thinking about boys. How do we learn how to encourage boys like you did in your sermon?
Well, this conversation could run and run, because this is a topic that we have barely scratched the surface of in the few minutes we spent together. But we do want to thank you, Nancy, not only for giving you your time with us today, but also for putting your time into and sticking your neck out, I would suggest, in your latest book, The Toxic War on Masculinity, How Christianity Reconciles the Sexes. Many of us are greatly indebted to you for your work over the years, and I think this book will be an extremely important contribution to a very, very pressing issue, not just sociologically, but as Todd has just pointed out, also pastorally. And to you, the listeners, please visit our website, mortificationofspin.org, and you will find there an opportunity to enter for a chance to win a copy of Nancy Pearcey's book, The Toxic War on Masculinity. If you don't win the book, please buy a copy. It will repay careful reading. Give it away to your friends. Discuss it with your friends. This is an extremely important issue, and Nancy has made an extremely important contribution to the discussion. While you're at a website, also please consider making a donation to Mortification of Spin. We are a listener-supported podcast. All that now remains for me to do is to thank our guest, Professor Nancy Pearcey, once again for giving us her valuable time, and to thank you, the listeners, for tuning in. We look forward to being with you next time.
Thanks for listening to Mortification of Spin, a podcast of the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals. For more on topics like this, visit mortificationofspin.org, where you can find other articles by Carl and Todd, browse the archive of past episodes, and make a donation. We'll talk to you next time on Mortification of Spin.